Well, Russian and Ukrainian delegations will hold a new round of face-to-face discussions this week. Ukraine has said to be demanding sovereignty and territorial integrity at the discussions which will be held in Turkey. And speaking of Turkey, the country's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, yesterday pressed for a ceasefire and better humanitarian conditions during a phone call with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Let's talk more about this then. We're joined by University of Pretoria political science lecturer Ronald Henwood. Good to speak to you, sir. Welcome to the program. Let's begin with the hosting of these negotiations between Ukraine and Russia by Turkey. President Erdogan getting on the phone yesterday with President Putin. Just how much influence does Ankara wield in all of this?
Ankara is influential. There's a long history of engagement between President Erdogan and President Putin. But there's also a history of differences and even conflict between them. And we have seen in the past Turkey standing up to Russia also in terms of some military dimensions. So I think it makes Turkey credible, also has vested interest, and there are shared interests between the countries. Turkey also keeping open the lines of communication to Ukraine. There's a history of relations between them. And that makes Turkey an interesting but also a viable mediator in that it has access to both governments. It seems to have the ear at least of both leaders. And in that sense, it can engage and hopefully achieve more in terms of negotiations than what we've seen so far.
And President Zelensky, speaking to a group of independent Russian journalists in the last 24 hours, said that Ukraine was willing to assume a neutral position, that Ukraine was also open to negotiations around the issue of the eastern Donbas region. Do you think that sort of concession or that position would be enough to pacify the Kremlin's position or the Kremlin's officials ahead of those talks this week?
That depends. It depends if it's an opening statement from Ukraine or is that the maximum that they're willing to go or that they're willing to offer. And also depends on, and I think this is quite important, if Russia thinks that it can achieve more by continuing with its military campaign, then it probably will go with the military campaign rather than engaging in negotiations as the beginning and end of the process. So there are many unknowns at this stage. I think the offer of neutrality is an important one. It's one of the basic arguments that have been put forward for the conflict to start, was the threat or the fear of Ukraine becoming a NATO member. And that's, of course, debatable how credible that is and how credible that was going to be. If we look at what NATO has done so far, they've kept a very clear distance between NATO as an organization and any indication that they will act on the side of Ukraine. But it may be quite an important issue. It at least takes off the table the argument that says the expansion of NATO is the driver of this conflict. The question of territorial sovereignty is going to be a different one. Up to now, Ukraine has said that it wants its territorial integrity reinstated and acknowledged and guaranteed if it accepts a different posture in terms of NATO being neutral, for instance. So willing to cede areas, it may be a negotiation strategy, it may be a point of departure, but it may be quite significant in that it moves away from the original position that Ukraine has taken. What is not clear is how Russia will read this, because they haven't made similar statements or given any indication. I think the only indication we got from Russia so far is to say that the objectives of phase one of the military operation has been achieved, and they are going to turn their attention back to the eastern parts of the country, basically to the areas that they have already annexed.
But how much longer, sir, do you think the Russians will be able to continue this invasion, this war, given that much of the international security analysis, at least, and it must be said this is a security analysis conducted by the likes of the UK, the United States, who are on the side of Ukraine, has been that the Russian advance has been stalled, and that one of the reasons is that Russia underestimated how complicated this would be. So how long are they willing to keep it going?
Well, I think it depends on how convinced the Russian leadership will be that they can achieve their objectives in a military way. And the indications are, as you've indicated, that the military campaign is not going well. There's also signs of Russian military units being pulled back into Belarus. Some say for reorganization. Others say they are moving out of the areas, especially around Kiev. And that the important thing is that the idea is no longer to take control of Ukraine and is no longer regime change in Ukraine, that they now accept they have to deal with President Zelensky and his government, and they are going to change their approach and focus on different, more achievable objectives. So, but the key question is, of course, for what duration and what cost are the Russians willing to incur to continue the military campaign, or have they really reached the point where they think that is no longer the best option?
So at the last meeting held in Turkey between the foreign ministers of the two countries, the Ukrainian foreign minister complained that there couldn't be much progress made because Sergei Lavrov of Russia basically could not make any decisions, and that whatever was discussed would ultimately have to go back to President Putin at the Kremlin to make a call. So if the two presidents, or until the two presidents are sitting face to face, can there be any real progress?
Yes, there can be progress, but I think the important thing is what delegation does somebody such as Mr. Lavrov have. And to make it more difficult, it is, if one looks at the analysis coming out, indications are that he wasn't aware of this military campaign and that the attack against Ukraine was going to happen. He was kept out of the loop. So maybe there is not that much trust between him and President Putin. It may be a question of using him to buy time to see how far they can go with the military campaign. At least he gives the semblance of legitimacy to negotiations. He is the foreign minister after all. But those are the unknowns that one looks at that will inform what happens in the end. And it's very difficult to determine the answers in advance from where we sit at this stage.